Good evening. My name is Karen Jensen, and I'm the director of the James Blackstone Memorial Library. I would like to welcome you all back to tonight's program to hear more from Debby Irving, author of Waking Up White. Last week's program generated more questions than we had time for. Additional questions were posed through the survey we sent following the program. So we thank Debby for her gracious offer to return this evening and continue the conversation with our moderators, Ms. Roberta Gill-Brooks and Ms. Lonnie Reed. And I would also like to thank the Branford Community Foundation and Branford Community Television once again for sponsoring this program with the library. Thank you. Bobby?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us again. We were overwhelmed and quite surprised and pleased with the response that we received last week with Debby's interview and her program that she presented to us. So we're happy that you're back. And as Karen said, we had so many questions. It's impossible for us to get to all of them, but we've sort of categorized them into those that were the most important, or the ones that were asked the most. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Lonnie Reed, who's going to introduce Debby again. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bobby. And it's welcome back, everybody. It's great to have you back. Last week, our guest tonight introduced us to the ugly truth that genuine racial equity eludes us, not by mistake, but by design. Long after slavery had been outlawed, treacherous new federal laws were implemented that, for example, denied 1.2 million Black soldiers returning from World War II access to the GI Bill. Laws and housing policies that embraced redlining to perpetuate segregated and substandard housing for Black Americans. As a teacher and a community organizer, a racial justice educator, and a writer, our guest encountered depressing revelations, revelations which she chronicled in her book, Waking Up White. Following her appearance last week, as Bobby said, we were inundated with all kinds of questions and observations. And we gathered all these thoughts, and we want to share some tonight. And it's my pleasure to once again introduce to you Debby Irving. Hello, Debby.
Hello, Lonnie and everyone, Branford. So happy to be back. You know, Lonnie, something you just said caught my attention, which is I discovered depressing facts. And my experience wasn't depressing, because for me, I was so relieved to find answers finally. I thought racism was something that couldn't be solved because people didn't understand how it worked. And once I started to realize, oh my gosh, like there's an explanation for this. This has been done by the hands of man, it can be undone. So I was rightly or wrongly motivated, and I guess I was simultaneously like grief-stricken and relieved to realize that there was a problem that could actually be studied and, I believe, solved. I know not everybody thinks that, but I'm going to choose to believe it can be solved because that will keep me energized to be a part of that.
I mean, I loved what you said. You know, one of your epiphanies was that the whole colorblind approach, the whole I'm a good person, isn't that enough? The answer to that was no. And I'm sort of just wondering, can you sort of guide us through that thought process for a sec?
Well, it's a lot of pressure when you think you have to be perfect, and I think there's a high value placed on the myth of perfectionism, and that's a part of dominant white culture. Not every culture believes that or promotes that idea, but it should be absolutely okay that every one of us human beings is a work in progress, and that our towns and our organizations are works in progress, and that our country is a work in progress. And I think we do a huge disservice. I'll speak in terms of the country. When we say we are the best country, we are the land of the free, we're missing a huge opportunity. If we could simply say, we want to be play well in the sandbox with every other country in the world, and we want to be a land where people feel free, the messaging there would be so much different. And just those simple changes would have really made it okay for me to think about the fact that there's a gap between where we are now and what the aspiration is. And that's a basic part of the human experience. Like if you go on a diet, you have an aspiration and you know where you are. And part of the knowing where you are is what helps you get better. We all set dreams all the time. I think though, when we go into denial and claim that that dream is already true, we cut off our learning and we cut off our growth.
I'm just going to so that takes us to our first question, and I'll be real quick with this. But so many people wanted to know what we can do as a community to get a more honest version of historical events. That we can learn a more honest version of historical events, and to get those revelations and those classes into the school system. And have you encountered communities that are doing that? When you're in all of the things that you've been doing.
Yes. So in the community and in the school are both separate and entwined. So the public, independent schools can actually do things much more quickly. Public school districts are, a little more cumbersome, and they have to adhere to state teaching standards. So there's a lot of bureaucracy there. And yet there are school districts and private schools, pre-K to higher ed all over the country doing really great work in terms of curriculum redesign. And so no one needs to start fresh. It's really about finding who's doing what in the country, who we can learn from. And then a big piece of that with schools is getting parent buy-in and then getting teachers up to speed. Because I couldn't have taught what I didn't know. I couldn't have held conversations with my students. If I had brought a new curriculum that brought conversations about race to the classroom, I wouldn't have known how to have those. I was taught my whole life it was rude. So I had no skill. So there's a lot of skill building and, getting people invested. That process has to happen. And in terms of what you can start learning in your community, this is where you want to start with a mindset of we don't necessarily need outside experts when we have got so much collective wisdom in our communities. So you have people of color in your community, including the amazing Bobby, who sort of brought us all together. Thank you, Bobby.
She did.
And it's, as a white person, my ideas about, especially a white person who's not in your community, I'm sort of the worst person to ask that question to. But you really want to ask that question of people of color in the community. How can we work together as a community to create a better quality of life so that you feel safe and you feel seen and you feel valued, and to have that conversation together and make those decisions together. I think that's the way. And I also think, we all have local history. So for instance, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, there's a wonderful Black woman who, I don't know how many years ago now, but she started what she called the African American, I think it's called the Black History Trail, the African American History Trail. And she has unearthed all of this history about Black communities that used to be in Portsmouth. And she has brought them to life with sculptures and trail markers. We are all on Indigenous land. Your community can work together to, make that visible. So I think I always say the process is the product. Meaning once you come together to start talking and having these conversations, that itself is the work. And there will be outcomes, but that you can't underestimate that the whole thing we're trying to do is build relationships that we've been taught we weren't supposed to have. And if anyone is in any relationship, which we all are, because we have parents and children and brothers and sisters and co-workers, relationships are messy. And this is no different. This can get really messy. And so we really need to make a commitment. I'm going to, until death do we part, I don't know. I'm going to stay in this mess with you. I know it's going to get hard. I'm going to make mistakes. And I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere. That's sort of the attitude, I think, that gets the communities that really make an impact through it.
Bobby, that's something you talk about, and I know you've got some questions that you wanted to.
Yes, this one I believe is verbatim from one of the attendees, but it seems to have been on the mind of many, so I'll just read it. It says, I was taught as a child never to discuss politics and religion in mixed company, and discussing racism was totally taboo. How do I go about bringing the topic up with friends and family members when I don't know how they feel about it? How do I handle a discussion with someone who downplays or denies the existence of systemic racism, white privilege, and or is afraid of apologizing for being white?
Yeah, so there are different questions in that question. So the first one is, how do I bring stuff up when I really don't know how someone's going to feel about it? And well, that's a risk, and it's a risk worth taking. Of course, your question was my question. You're just not so many years ago, maybe 12 years ago, and I found that what worked was, and I would say, have you ever heard of redlining? I would just say, because I'm learning about it, and it's so shocking to me, and shocking that I never learned about it. I'm asking everybody I know, have you heard of redlining? How do you understand it? And so put on your interviewer's hat and start just engaging with family and friends with this is that radical curiosity I talked about. Now to another question that was in that question was, what if I encounter somebody who denies there's such a thing as systemic racism? Again, you can say, have you heard of redlining is a great one. Did you know about the GI Bill? Because that was something that I heard about that really helped me understand systemic racism. Are you familiar with it? And it helps to have get the story straight, so you can kind of explain it. And you're not explaining it like this. You're like, and then I learned. And then if you encounter somebody who says, I'm sick of being made to feel guilty, I would ask a genuine question, like, who's making you feel guilty? Explore the guilt. Why do you feel guilty? You didn't cause this. You didn't create this problem. So why do you feel guilty? And then share your own, like, yeah, sometimes I feel guilty because it just feels, I don't want to have more than other people. I thought the world was fair. Then see if you can kind of build a bond around, I have felt guilty, and then explain that for me, and whatever is true for you, I turn that guilt into like motivation, anger. I don't want to live in an unfair world, but I don't let myself sit in that guilt. Those are my suggestions for that.
Place to start, most definitely.
And I will tell you, role playing, I don't know if you have any kind of role playing experience in your community, if you do it for any reason, but role playing, I have a workshop called Transformational Conversations, where we spend the better part of 2 hours role playing. It's so important to practice, especially for those of us who have been taught not to speak about it. Our physiology will it takes a while to be able to be in these conversations in a way where we don't panic and seize up.
Lonnie, I think you have the next one.
I do, Bobby. Thank you. And so we're kind of circling back, and Debbie, as you said, so many of these questions sort of interweave and keep coming back to the same place. But I think so many people are hungry for an action plan. Okay, I've had this revelation, I've had this epiphany, now what? And so this is one of the questions that we got, is that it was so truly enlightening. It made me feel motivated to want to do more. And I was hoping to come away with more concrete steps. What can we do as a community, raise more awareness, to teach our children about racial justice, and to promote programs that include people of color? Can you provide examples of communities that have adopted progressive ideas that have worked? And you alluded to those, but I'm wondering if you can kind of dive a little deeper on that.
Yeah, so this is sort of a firing on multiple cylinders project. And when it comes to ways that we can, include more people of color, again, that's where we white people, we want to get out of the habit of making decisions for people of color. And we want to say, what can we do? Is there an initiative that you want to create that we can support? Is there an initiative you want to co-create? How would you like to move forward? That's very different than white people's work, which can and should happen simultaneously. There's a really incredible course that's been running for 22 years or 21 years now in Cambridge, Mass. We have a Center for Adult Education. It's called White People Challenging Racism, Moving from Talk to Action.
Oh, wow.
And it's a 5-week course, and it's, I think, 2 hours or 2.5 hours. Like, let's say it's every Monday night for 5 weeks, and there's homework in between. And it's taught by co-facilitators. So there's always 2 people. Often it's a racially mixed or generationally mixed or gender mixed somehow pair of facilitators. And it costs like $35. It's meant to be super accessible. And I was one of those teachers. We volunteered. I did it for several years before I started traveling so much. And the way the course breaks down is it's about a third learning, reading articles, watching films, podcasts, etc. It's about a third practicing conversations and getting good conversational skills. And the other third is an action plan. You cannot leave that class without having an action plan. And the action plan, and they take you through the whole process. An action plan might be, I'm going to start a book club with my family. I'm going to do the 21-day challenge with my family. Or the action plan might be, I'm going to start a diversity committee at, my major corporation. But that's sort of the range. I'm going to learn more about who is leading the charge for housing inequity in the New Haven area, the greater New Haven area. So the action plan, we always encourage people who come up with their action plan to really think. We ask them first to think about 5 different parts of their lives, their family, their workplace, maybe their faith community, their leisure, and pick a place that really they could get some good allies in there, some people to brainstorm about the action plan and help carry it out with. So I think it's unrealistic to think that white people who are just waking up can do anything very effective other than, in terms of action, other than join and support an organization that's already in full swing, where leadership there does really understand how this works, what the barriers are, and hopefully is people of color led. It's not a time to go start an initiative or start an organization unless your initiative is to pull other white people into your own learning process with you. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be frustrating. And yet, please know, and Bobby, I'd be curious your thoughts on this. I think the first order of business is, can you, white person, get into a place where when I tell you about something that's happened to me, you hear it, you believe it, you honor it? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important would that be?
11.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, you also have to keep in mind that this kind of goes to the next question. Branford is a predominantly white town, 94%. So a lot of our residents don't necessarily come into contact with people of color on a regular basis. How often would they? And so they're concerned about how can they have these conversations and relationships if they are rarely or never in proximity of people of color. How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we have enormous racial and ethnic and class diversity. And there's this pattern of everyone sticking to their own kind anyway. So even if you have people of color in your community, there's no guarantee that you're going to have those relationships unless you do your de-whitening work, which is to really, get conversational skills. So the kind of conversational skills we need to have really deep authentic relationships with, as white people, with people of color, you can start practicing those in all your white relationships. So that's where, learning to take some risks and be willing to engage in conflict. Conflict doesn't need to look like this. It can be a conversation where you're really trying to figure each other out and trying to figure out how to move your relationship or an issue forward. So in the meantime, I think you've got some people of color there, and it sounds like there are people of color there who would love to have more white people who are, I'm going to say, relationship worthy, which sounds judgmental, but we really have so much trust building to do as white people And we have to be patient with ourselves and our Black and brown townsfolk, and not ask them to just give space for this slow trust building process to begin. And in the meantime, there's so much listening to be done. There are podcasts, there are videos, and I know that might sound like I don't want to do that. Well, we have to retrain our brain and our mindset, and we have to get used to hearing a perspective that we're not used to, and we can do that in a non-harmful way by relying first on sources that already exist before we go out into dynamic settings. It's a little bit like going to a batting cage before you get out on the field.
You know, when you talk about, and this, I think this is one of the hard things, because, you know, so many people will pay lip service to wanting these relationships. But the minute it gets uncomfortable, and you talk about that, you have to go to that place if you're truly committed. I mean, if you're not, and people see that, that's got to be disingenuous. You know, it's sort of like you're going to be swept along. And I mean, it feels like on your personal journey, you came, you know, you were all ready, because I love reading your book, how, you know, your big game plan was to do good work. That's what you wanted to do. And so you went into careers like this. And then suddenly along the way, you discovered all of these realities of why it was more complicated than you initially thought. Oh, I'm going to teach, I'm going to show, you know, and then you realize, God, you had more to learn than you had to teach. Exactly. And so I'm just wondering, sort of, do you find that the most successful people who kind of pursue real change in relationships, you know, really confront themselves in honest ways, that they, you know, that they really go there and they can tolerate being uncomfortable? As you say, in families, you can get uncomfortable in families, that you can tolerate being uncomfortable as part of the process.
Yes, absolutely. Taking ourselves on, developing these conversational skills. And, you know, it's important to note, people of color have to read white people as if their lives depend on it, because they do.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
And so when we think, oh, something's bothering me, but I'm not going to show it, I guarantee you 100% that that person of color in the room with you knows, the antenna know that you're uncomfortable, because that's when danger begins for them. And so you have to learn to not fake it. You have to learn to say, I feel like there's an elephant in the room. I don't know what it is. You don't have to tell me. I just want to acknowledge I'm flustered right now. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, but, or I have a really awkward question to ask. And if you want to say to me, I'm not going to answer it, just do, I'm fine. This is the level of honesty that we need to get to. And, you know, I write in my book about this time where I knew I messed up. I confused a Black woman's daughter with the one other Black girl on one of my daughter's sports teams. And I knew I had messed up, and I tried to fake it. I tried to just, like, you know, and she said, oh, it's no big deal. Well, of course it was a big deal to her. And I knew that. And I had to screw up the courage to call her later and apologize. And it took her a while to, you know, admit it wasn't because I was forcing her, but it took her a bit into the phone conversation to say, you know, it really infuriated me. You know, and thanks for calling. That it's not only is it okay to mess up, but it's completely unavoidable. You know, if you're married, have you ever messed up in your marriage? Like, it's impossible to be in a relationship and not have a harmful impact on someone once in a while. And it's so important to own it, because that's when the tension diffuses.
I was just going to say that this last question, we talked about this a little bit before we actually came on air, and I'm going to just jump in there. This one came and it said, I can agree with Blacks up to the point where they riot and loot their own businesses and neighborhoods. How can I understand and be supportive of that when it's not right? The ladies reminded me that in my speech, I had said that, you know, when you're worried about property being damaged ahead of lives being destroyed, you've got your priorities backwards. It's not so much, the properties being destroyed, they need to stop. No, it's a shame that the property, it's a shame the property is being destroyed, but the killing of Black men has to stop. Now, as far as them rioting and looting in their own businesses and neighborhoods, I think that's just out of frustration and anger, because we may feel that in our own community, but it's not like we can go up to the white community and burn anything down or loot anything. We'll be dead. So I'm just curious, Debbie, what you have to say about that. That was a conversation we had.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. And I would also offer, there's an incredible 3-minute video called How Can We Win? By Kimberly, I want to say Kimberly Jones. It's in, I can send it afterwards, but she is saying, she's responding, she's a Black woman, she's a children's author, and she's responding to that question. I think, again, I totally want to echo and amplify what Bobby said. Our priorities are wrong when we say, well, we'll support you fighting for your own lives unless some property gets touched. And why don't we cut off every white person we know when white property gets harmed? I mean, another piece of this is Black on Black crime, which I hear people say, but crime generally tends to happen in our own circles. And because we are geographically segregated and social role segregated, of course, that's where crime starts to happen. And I ask people to think about, what is white on white crime? And, white on white crime includes everything from, murder and rape, as it does within any ethnic or racial group. It also, though, can include gargantuan power moves like mortgage scandals, pyramid schemes where people are losing, or what about, the opioid crisis. So
Right.
to not bring in a more holistic view. White people we tend to see as individuals, whereas Black and brown people we tend to see as groups. So like those bad white men who did that, those were just random men. Whereas we don't say, well, those were just random people who's, were so frustrated that they, broke in and got that my age, that stereo. I'm so old fashioned, that piece of electronic equipment that they can't afford. Just screw it. I'm going to go get it. And why wouldn't people be frustrated? And I think it's very important to be 100% clear that Black Lives Matter, that movement is born out of deep love. It's Black liberation, which is rooted in love. I was taught that the Black Panther movement was this, so scary. It was these men with guns. They had breakfast and reading programs for children. So I think we should be clear about who Black Lives Matter is as a part of being anti-racist, because Black Lives Matter is so huge. I've recently read Alicia Garza's The Purpose of Power. That's her memoir. Doesn't sound like a memoir, but it is. And also Patrice Kahn-Collard's book, When They Call You a Terrorist. Get to know who these people are. Black Lives Matter is not setting out to be violent. They are setting out to get the same constitutional rights that white people enjoy. Anyone else want to add to that? Because I think it's a really common place that people get tripped up. But what about the looting? We can compare the insurrection. Isn't that looting?
Well, and as we've discussed earlier, and it's been on the news and on every broadcast, if you get any African-American commentator about, the insurrection, we all know without a shadow of a doubt that if that had been Black people, they would have still been cleaning up the blood. Mm-hmm. And they would have still been cleaning up the blood, and they would have still been carrying away bodies, and it would have, would never have died down. But now it's sort of like, well, turn the page, it ended. And that's just infuriating Black people more than, because that situation was white privilege on steroids.
Right. Well, and I have to say, I worked in the U.S. Capitol. I worked for a U.S. Senator many years ago in my youth. And even if you know it, and you know where you're going, you can never find it. I mean, it's really hard to get around in the US Capitol and find these offices. There was such an inside job component to that. And that to me, and I think that's going to come out more and more and more. But so now you're talking about the destruction. 5 people died. You know, people were traumatized, beaten up. Property was destroyed. Our property was destroyed. That's our money. That's our house. And there was a whole white component to it. And, you know, and an organizational component. If Black Lives Matter had come to the Capitol and, you know, and any numbers of civil rights folks, they would have ringed that sucker with so many soldiers prior to it. They never would have been able to invade the Capitol. So that tells you everything you need to know about perspective, white privilege, and the idea, oh, there's just going to be a bunch, you know, obviously some inside job folks were saying, oh, it's just going to be a bunch of white people coming here to express themselves, you know. It's talk about double standards and double standards that threaten all of us. And that's what that was.
And I don't know if anyone has seen the photograph from how the Capitol staffed up for the Black Lives Matter protest that was this summer. I have it up on my screen. I could screen share, or you could just look for it. But, you know, the Capitol steps, there's hardly any space on the steps because it is thick with security. And that speaks to the insider, the, you know, the sense of threat. So yes, double standard, and double standards are in the school system, policing, healthcare, and I could go on, but Bobby, I think I cut you off. Were you about to
I was just saying that I know that we're rounding up on our half an hour, and I just wanted to express my personal thanks to you, Debbie, for agreeing to come on with us. It's been a great experience for everybody, an eye-opening experience. This whole situation has really come to life, and a lot of people are interested in learning more and doing more, and we really appreciate your input so much. So thank you.
Well, keep it going, and I'm going to send you the White People Challenging Racism link right now so you can follow up with them if you want to start a course like that in your own community.
That's a great idea. Thank you so much, Debbie. And I'm sure we're gonna continue being in touch.
I hope so. Maybe someday even in person. I've got to go shovel now.
Okay, good. Yeah, get that. Be a Renaissance woman. Go out there and shovel. Get that done.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And we just wanted to say to everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And everybody, so many people have been asking for other books and to learn more about, you know, the kinds of things that we can all do on our own and in concert with members of our community to learn more about this issue. And so the Blackstone, thank you to the Blackstone. Thank you to, you know, all the Branford groups that are supporting us. The Branford Community Foundation. We're going to send out a whole list of some of the books that are available. And I should also mention that on February 15th, I think at noon, Jane Elliott, who is the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment racial educator. She's a force to be reckoned with. And she was unbelievable at the Martin Luther King breakfast. And there were so many people who wanted to ask more questions. So she's coming back on February 15th. And the Blackstone will send out a link on how you can do that too, if you haven't done it already, to sign up for that. And she's going to answer a lot of questions from, I think, noon to 3. So be sure to participate in that.
And we also just want to invite everyone to please stay tuned to what the Awakening to Change group has coming forward. We've got some other plans for other activities and other events. So stay tuned, keep in touch. We will keep you informed as best we can. And, you know, everything starts with one step. You don't get anywhere without a first step. And I'm just pleased and proud that the community has come forward so much and has been so open to learning more. So thank you, everyone.